I'm John Law, this is Chasing Cars, and this is a Hyundai Ioniq Plug-In Hybrid. Now, in today's review, we're going to be doing a detailed overview of this car, telling you what we like and dislike about it, but we're also going to be talking about plug-in hybrids in a more general sense and the future of mobility, because Hyundai actually sells this car in 3 permutations, including a regular series parallel hybrid, this plug-in, and a full electric vehicle. So we're going to be discussing the pros and cons of each and coming to a conclusion as to whether or not we reckon the plug-in hybrid has a place in the market. But of course, I want to know what you think in the comments section down below. So leave a comment at any point during this video telling me whether you think a plug-in hybrid is a good idea for us here in Australia. Now, just before we get into the interior, I do want to point out something pretty cool about the front of this Ioniq, at least in my opinion, and that is this grille, which for a start looks pretty snazzy, but it also has the ability to open and close depending on the cooling needs of the car and to keep it really nice and efficient and cutting through the wind well. So I think that's pretty cool. But anyway, let's hop inside the interior of the Ioniq and see exactly what the cabin is like. So inside the Ioniq, there's a couple of really nice little features and there's a couple of little weird details which I'm not quite so sure about. Now the variant we have here is the Premium, and that is the upper spec one you can buy. It's available across the 3 permutations of hybrid, plug-in and electric, and it's pretty much the same across those. So that means you get a really crisp 10.25 inch touchscreen, which runs Hyundai's own navigation system, which runs really nicely. But of course there's also Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, though that uses a wire, not wireless yet. Now there's also DAB radio in there, and it all works really nicely. You've got these shortcut buttons down below that are all digital, so no hard buttons here, which to some people may be good, may be bad. Below it, you've got a really nice, sleek integration of the climate control down here with dual zone, and you can select it so that the fan only goes to the driver for a slightly better economy. Down below, you've got this sort of low center stack, which to me seems a little bit weird. It feels like it's a combination of a bunch of different Hyundai products down here, like i30 and Sonata, and it doesn't quite work that well. However, you do have a fair bit of kit down here, including heated seats and cooled seats, and the ability to change between the drive modes, which we'll get back to in the driving impressions. There's also a heated steering wheel in this Premium variant, which is a really nice touch. The steering wheel is, of course, a leather-wrapped item, as is the gear stick, and the seats are leather upholstered as well. You do sit in a bit of a weird position though. It feels like you're sort of planted on top of the chassis of this Ioniq. You feel quite tall. You never really feel like it's sunk down. However, you do have electric seat adjustment to fine-tune everything nicely with memory function for the driver as well. And you've got a digital driver's display in front of you, which gives you all the info you need, and I reckon actually looks pretty good. There's a pretty funny little startup animation as well, as seems to be the way with all of these eco-friendly cars at the moment. And yeah, the ambience of the interior is pretty decent. I'm not totally sold on this kind of dark grey colorway, but let me know what you think in the comments section down below. You've also got a sunroof in this Premium variant and a fair bit of soft touch materials, though it does go to scratchy hard plastic down here around the center console, and it doesn't feel too well screwed together there. However, the rest of the interior is pretty quality. As for practicalities, you've got a couple of weirdly shaped cup holders which take a bottle nicely, and some door bins which flex to take a bigger or smaller bottle, and some comfy little armrest padding here for the driver. So all in all, the front cabin is a fine place to be, with a couple of highlights which include this really crisp touchscreen. Now let's see how practical the rear seat of the Ioniq is. Jumping in the back door, which opens really nice and wide, which makes it easy to hop into the back seat of the Ioniq, and you're greeted with a fair amount of space. Now, as you'll probably know, I'm 6'2", and for me there is just enough headroom. If I sit up completely straight, my head does just brush the ceiling. And in front of me there is a decent amount of knee room and quite a generous amount of toe room, thanks to the high set driving position. As for content back here, you've got one little net behind the passenger seat, and you've also got rear seat air vents, which is a really nice touch for me. You've got some funky air vents in the side of the materials, just on the passenger side. I don't know exactly what that's about, but there's not one on the driver's side. As for other stuff, we got this flip down armrest, which feels like a quality item, and you've got 2 cup holders here. And as you kind of expect, the rear seat moves to hard touch materials for the door card in the back, but you still get a fairly nicely padded armrest. So It's okay back here, but perhaps you don't want to be spending too much time in here, especially given the lack of charging ports and the slightly scratchy materials. Now let's jump around to the boot and see what the practicality is like. So around to the back of the Ioniq, and you know it's a plug-in because it says plug-in on the boot. The electric car has EV written there, and it's definitely got that sort of eco car look, which seems to be a theme with double windscreen split into two. I don't know if this is particularly more aerodynamic or something like that, but it's definitely a theme that runs throughout. Now, popping that boot, which is manually operated, which at a little bit over $50,000, you might be expecting to get an electric boot. You do have a slightly big load lip here, but it's not a big issue to slide stuff over and above. You can load this boot up with 357 litres of cargo, say Hyundai, and you've got quite a nice sturdy cargo cover that rolls backwards and forwards to keep your stuff away from prying eyes. Now, you do have a luggage net as well, which is an absolute personal must-have for me. Stop stuff rolling around in the boot. And yeah, it's a pretty nicely finished place. While you do have a luggage cover, you don't have any shopping bag hooks though. And under the boot floor, you have a space to store your charging cable, and that's where the rest of the batteries and stuff sit. So unfortunately, there's no spare tire, full-sized or space saver in the Ioniq. But again, just like the Prius, it kind of makes sense given this car's urban intentions. Now let's pop that boot down. Not too bad, not too heavy and not too light to do, and yeah, let's get this thing out on the road and see how she handles. So, driving the 2020 Hyundai Ioniq Plug-In Hybrid. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is the drivetrain, because that's kind of the whole point of this review. This being a plug-in hybrid, it marks as a bit of a funky bridge between the gap of a series parallel hybrid and a full EV. Now, Hyundai does offer both of those options on this car, as we've already discussed, and we've actually spent a fair bit of time in both of those other options. So today we're going to be looking at the PHEV, which has a combined output of 104 kilowatts and 264 newton meters of torque. That's from a 1.6 litre Atkinson cycle 4-cylinder engine and a 44.5 kilowatt electric motor, which can also produce 170 newton meters on its own. Now, this drivetrain also links those up with a 6-speed dual clutch gearbox. It's the same sort of thing as in the regular hybrid of this vehicle, same outputs and all that sort of stuff, just a slightly smaller battery. And that does make it feel a little bit weird to me. I'm used to EV cars and hybrid cars having a either seamless kind of gearbox like a CVT or no gears, as in the case of most full EVs. So it's a bit weird that when the petrol motor kicks in, you can actually feel the quite pronounced steps of the 6-speed gearbox. It also presents itself in a slightly strange way when you floor the throttle, and you get this extra sort of surge after about a second and a half of waiting on full throttle, as I'm not exactly sure what happens, but I think it's the kick down of the gearbox combined with the electric motors filling the torque. But anyway, we're going to talk about how it is in urban settings, and that for me is where this car is probably going to spend most of its time, and that's where you would pick the plug-in hybrid over like the series parallel hybrid, for example. Because in urban areas, this car can waft about on electric motors as long as you remember to plug it in and charge it overnight. You can waft around for, Hyundai say about 60 kilometers. We found that range to vary between sort of 35 kilometers at higher speed driving and up to 60 in full-on urban settings. And that's really, really great, actually. You do find that the petrol engine does sometimes kick in even when the battery is fully charged. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but when you're on battery only, it's a very refined, easy car to drive in town, and it returns really, really good fuel economy, as you would expect, of generally below 0.7 litres per 100 kilometres, because as I said, the petrol motor seems to kick in occasionally. Maybe it's just from throttle inputs, that sort of thing. Now, the other advantage of the plug-in hybrid, because honestly the full EV would make more sense around town because you've just got an electric powertrain, so you don't have to worry about the petrol motor kicking in. But where this makes more sense is if you want to go out on the weekend and take it on, say, a 300-400 kilometre round trip where you're not sure if there's going to be charging stations, because the total range combined with the petrol motor in this car is generally about 850 kilometres. And on a trip like that, where you're seeing a little bit more highway usage, a little bit more sort of up and down, some hilly examples and some twisty back roads, you'll probably see fuel economy around 3.5 litres per 100. which is very comparable to something like, say, a Toyota Prius hybrid or this car in series parallel hybrid. And it just adds that extra ability to get out of the city, which is, again, something that in Australia you need a bit more distance on offer for. So for me, that's where the plug-in hybrid does make a lot of sense. Now, if you're still going to have a second car, like your previous generation car that is petrol or diesel or conventional combustion engine car, then for me, I would go for a full electric car if you're going to keep that as your weekend vehicle. But not everyone has the privileges of having two cars. Obviously, I understand that very well. Now, the other thing we've got to discuss as well is the ability to fast charge, because in a full EV, you can recuperate about 80% of charge in 30 minutes with a 50 kilowatt direct charger. That's what this car in its EV form recuperates in half an hour. And that's actually a pretty generous time frame. You can go to a supermarket, do some shopping, maybe sit down and have a coffee and relax while your car charges up, and adds a pretty significant chunk to the range. However, to charge this 8.9 kilowatt hour battery takes somewhere between 2 and 4 hours, depending on whether you've got the Hyundai supplied wall box or whether you're just plugging it into regular 220 volt power outlets. So that's a really long time, and I guess you could watch a movie while your car was charging if you didn't have the ability to charge it at home, but you're probably not going to be able to go shopping and recuperate enough energy. That's where you rely on the petrol engine again, but it does make it a little bit more of an effort to use. That being said, that 60 kilometers of range that you get from this vehicle is enough to get you to and from work in the week. So it's all really based on your condition, and I completely understand why Hyundai offers this permutation here in Australia, because, as I said, it does tend to make a lot of sense for some other people. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about drive modes as well, because you can obviously lock this into its full EV mode, or you can use hybrid EV mode, or you can just pick auto, which preferences whatever the car thinks is smartest for that period of time. And that works quite well. You need to have at least sort of 20% battery to be able to select EV mode, and then yeah, it's pretty sweet. And it relies on the electric motors, not the petrol engine, as much as it can, and that makes the throttle response really doughy. Now, there's no actual drive modes per se which affect the steering weight and pedal feedback, save for the sport mode, which is accessed via the gear selector down here in the center console. And that's weird, because the eco mode for me, which this car is locked into as a default, has incredibly doughy throttle response. You've got to push the throttle all the way down before anything meaningful happens. However, if you knock it into sport mode, then the only usable part of the throttle travel is really the first third, which makes it feel quick, but artificially so. And so for me, that's a bit of an annoying thing, that there's no sort of natural feeling mode. As for the steering weight, it doesn't really make a noticeable difference. It's certainly not too heavy and claggy in sport mode. Now, in sport mode, the paddles behind the steering wheel work to select the gears in the DCT gearbox. However, in normal mode, they adjust your braking regeneration levels. So there's 3 levels. You've got level 3, which is its most aggressive, level 2, which is a medium setting, which to me feels most like a traditionally manual geared car or something like that, shifted 1 gear down from where you would normally be for engine braking, and level 1, which I tend to use the most just to recuperate a little bit of that charge, and it feels pretty natural. Now, the other surprise thing about this Ioniq plug-in hybrid, I don't know if it's exactly to do with the low weight of the batteries, but it actually gets down and boogies on a back road pretty well. That, especially locked into sport mode, that electric motor gives a little bit of torque feel on exit of corners, and it makes it feel like you're making quite swift, brisk progress. The chassis is well sorted enough as well that it rides nice and 4 square, neutral, tending to a little bit of understeer in a safe way, but with a little bit of a mid-corner throttle lift, you can get the car to tuck in a little bit more and trim its line. So for me, it's actually a remarkably well-handling car for something with sort of eco credentials that it's touting from the outside at least. Then there's the actual ride of the car. It's not quite as well tuned as the full EV Ioniq, but it's really not bad. Not bad at all, in fact. It feels like the wheelbase is nice and long, it absorbs bumps in a nice 4 square manner, and it's not too firm in the city without sacrificing the sort of ability to cinch in that float on these country roads like we are on now. So I think Hyundai's Australian ride tuning program has really paid off well for them across their entire range, including this Ioniq. Now, over our test period, we returned a total fuel economy figure of 3.2 litres per 100 kilometres, but that is with a couple of caveats. So one of the drives that we took this on was our normal test loop, which is a quite open flowing road, and that brought the fuel economy, it sort of impacted it, as I said before, up to about 3.8 litres per 100 kilometres. But in the city, when you've got charge in the battery, that's where this car wins, because you can keep it below 1.5 litres per 100 without really trying too hard. And that equates to a really, really low fuel cost. Now, Hyundai claims 1.1 litres per 100 for this vehicle. Again, that is with the battery charged and all that. So we would expect to spend about a total of 2.5 litres per 100 kilometres over, say, 12 months of ownership if it's in the city. And you're going to be looking at spending not much more than $250 a year on petrol. Now, obviously, you have to take into account how much you've got to charge this car as well, which if you're charging it off your home electricity supply can be a little bit expensive, but that's all part of owning an EV. Now, the other thing, this Hyundai doesn't feel quite as well built out on the road as it did when you're sitting still. You do start to hear little movements from trim pieces. This car has got a fair few Ks on it, so coming up to 9,000 Ks. So that's quite a lot of Ks for a press car, and they do get a pretty hard life. But the center console makes audible sort of creaking noises when you move it, and when your knee rests upon it, it makes quite a lot of creaking noise. That said, NVH in terms of road noise from these Michelin tires is very well suppressed. They don't make a lot of noise at all, the Eco tires. And the wind noise, this car cuts through the wind pretty well, as you'd expect from a vehicle like this, and again, it's very well suppressed. As for safety features, it's got Hyundai's full sense of smart sense technology, so that means a really good lane keep assist and a really good adaptive cruise control, which is adjustable speed and distance and works nicely. And you've got some other cool things like blind spot monitoring, a pretty crisp reversing camera, and front and rear parking sensors and rear cross traffic alert. So you're pretty set up in the Ioniq, and it's not a difficult car to drive in urban environments because the glasshouse is generally pretty good and it's easy to see out of and airy enough. There's no weird blind spots created by any of the weird design features in here. So that's what the Hyundai Ioniq plug-in hybrid is like to drive, and I think it carves itself a nice little niche out in the market. So that brings us to the need for a little bit of a sum up of our thoughts on the 2020 Hyundai Ioniq plug-in hybrid. I reckon it's got its place in the market. There are people who will find this car really, really good because you get that electric only range for driving around the city, driving to work, or running errands or all that sort of stuff. But you can also take it out on a longer trip. Say you wanted to go camping, or you wanted to go just appreciate the scenery in Australia or wherever you live in the world. It makes a lot of sense without that extra range anxiety you get with a full EV. That being said, it doesn't take fast charge, which can be a little bit annoying. On the whole though, the Ioniq is, I would say, a pretty good car. I like the way it looks, I like the way it drives, and it's well suspended. So I think it's a pretty good option, and it's great that Hyundai offers all three drivetrain permutations for this car. But I want to hear what you think of the Ioniq down in the comments section below. And while you're down there, we'd love it if you could hit subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.